So our final panelist is Hanna-Mari Ahonen, a senior consultant for Perspectives Climate Research. She's worked with international EU and Nordic climate policy and carbon markets since 2002. At Perspectives, she focuses on the means to promote ambitious climate action in both the public and private sectors, including carbon markets and negative emissions technologies. So Hannah is going to be able to talk a little bit more, I think, about some of the economic factors that both Cody and Jess brought up at the tail end of their conversations. Hannah, I have your slides here if you would like me to share.
I'll try sharing myself. Maybe that's easier, but okay. Let's see. Let's hope it's easier. Everybody else seemed to manage to do it. Can you see them now?
No, it's yes. Now I can see your slides.
Here we go. So yeah, I will be looking more at the policies, accounting and finance and how they would be needed to scale up negative emissions on a general level. And maybe just a quick run on the wordings from the Paris Agreement where they're talking about mitigation that includes removals and emission reductions. And basically the whole need for nets comes from the Paris Agreement's requirement to balance emissions and removals by 2050 or thereabouts. And removals would need to be stored durably to become negative emissions. So there is the issue of permanence also that needs to be kept in mind, that when something is removed from the atmosphere on a permanent level, then we're talking about negative emissions. And there's different types of barriers to scaling up negative emissions. Some of them are still facing the innovation and demonstration barriers. I think I saw some questions about the level of maturity of these different solutions. Then there is non-financial barriers relating to regulation, accounting or lack of accounting, and also infrastructure needs and the lack of infrastructure. And of course, financial barriers, that's the obvious one. But also with the externalities and risks, there might be opposition from the public to some of the nets if there are perceived or real risks and externalities that really need to be studied and kept in mind if we want to really scale up negative emissions. And we're working on a research project on negative emissions called NetRapido, which is funded by the Swedish Energy Agency, and it's running until the next year. And this is quite a broad research project, not just looking at technical potential costs and barriers, but also the environmental and social aspects with a lot of stakeholder consultations, and the governance and accounting and how they are important for creating policies and incentives, especially to mobilize private finance. So that's where I'm coming from. And we partnered with Mälardalen University in Sweden and also Climate Strategies in the UK. And quite recently, we published a report on the role of nets in the Paris Agreement, so bringing it into that kind of a world and language as well. And some of the recommendations to incorporate nets into national long-term strategies include that there should be specific targets for nets research and deployment. As someone was saying, that really there is this fundamental demand, but it needs to be translated into targets. And then beyond targets, of course, to policies and incentives. It's also very important to bring different people together, not just the mitigation experts, but also the sector stakeholders and sector ministries for elaborating nets policies at the sectoral level, because nets is actually a selection of quite different types of technologies. And that's what's happening in the Nordic countries at the moment. We have net zero or even net negative targets. For example, Finland, where I'm based, has a target to be net negative by 2035, which is 15 years away. And so we've had our sectors work on roadmaps where they're looking at ways to get net negative within the next 15 years. And that really reveals where are the sectors that need other sectors to provide negative emissions for them to get to net zero and beyond. And that's where it gets very concrete. And the next step from there is then having a process for approving nets policies and options and strategies for policy planning and stakeholder consultation. It becomes very real very quickly once you get the ball rolling. And I realize that some of the colleagues from the US maybe don't have the same kind of a momentum at the moment. But with the Nordics, we have the targets are there, and also we are quite used to paying taxes. So carbon taxes and carbon pricing is quite feasible in our Nordic context and in the European context as well. So there will be some options for our nets is to introduce incentives for some prioritized nets, whether they're sort of technology neutral or technology specific incentives. That's something to be discussed. And if we want to mobilize private finance for nets, then these incentives could be linked to the emissions trading schemes, which we have in Europe, or carbon tax liabilities, which we also have here in Europe. And so if we look at the targets and policies, as I said, the key is to have those targets in place in the first instance, so to drive the demand. And then the next step of having those government interventions, which are essential for scaling up most of the nets, not necessarily the ones that the colleagues explained that work through commercially, being commercially profitable, but quite a few nets aren't profitable without government intervention. But there are some examples of existing policies that promote nets. In the US, there is a federal tax incentive for carbon dioxide storage, and that could be combined with a Californian low carbon fuel standard CCS protocol, which also gives an incentive. If I remember correctly, it's about $200 per ton of incentives for carbon storage. In the Nordics, we have different types of support for research and development, demonstration, even full-scale BECCS plant support is planned, and then support for transport and storage of carbon dioxide. In Sweden, there is this program called Industry Klivet, or the Industry Leap program, I think in English. And in Norway, there's a recently launched Longship project, which is supporting nets and CCS more generally, quite broadly. And in UK, there is a host of different activities supporting nets activities, supporting testing of industrialized clusters and mapping storage potential and so forth. Also, it's really important that you have accounting for nets, because otherwise you won't recognize the mitigation impacts of nets, and then also you can't really do a proper policy on it. And at the moment, the accounting frameworks are still kind of set in the emission reduction mode rather than a negative emissions mode. So many methodologies and the inventories don't really recognize that there can be negative emissions. They're still kind of set in that positive emission framework. But I mean, that's something that can be done. It just hasn't been done yet. So you would need accounting frameworks to estimate how nets contribute to climate targets, and also to provide access to incentives based on results, like certificate trading, for example. And you need this accounting framework to be robust for your mitigation to be credible, and also for your carbon pricing to be effective. And some of the specific issues about accounting of nets is dealing with permanence, because a reversible storage is not equivalent to a permanent storage. So that needs to be taken into account. Also, some of these nets could have cross-border dimensions. So you could capture the carbon in one country, transport it and store it in another country, or even in international waters. So how and for whom would you then account the mitigation when you're thinking about meeting climate targets under the Paris Agreement, for example? And generally, the net's potential for the storage and the capture is unevenly distributed around the world. So if we want all countries to go towards net zero and net negative, it would be crucial to have international collaboration, and that would need very internationally consistent accounting frameworks. And once the policies and accounting are in place, then the finance can start rolling. And some of these nets will really need some long-term funding instruments, which are not yet in place and need to be scaled up. And especially in the early stages, with the high cost nets. So not necessarily the ones that are profitable, that's a different story, but a lot of these nets are still at the stages where they do need some early public funding to drive down the costs. And of course, the type and amount of support depends on what kind of maturity we're talking about, the life cycle, and also the component, because some of these components are capturing and then transport and storage, and they're quite different. Transport infrastructure and storage infrastructure will need public support. And some of the examples is like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. they're having a carbon price, whether from the government or from voluntary carbon markets, for example, could start these full-scale plants to make a profit. And that's exactly what Fabian was talking about, really how to turn this demand into actual market transactions, and to my understanding also to have that carbon price there. Whether it's a subsidy or maybe voluntary carbon markets are already looking at trading in BECCS credits if they would come available. With biochar and enhanced weathering, there still need to be support for piloting and long-term testing. And then with direct air capture and storage, there would be need for more research to help with the scaling and also to reduce the costs. There you go. I ran through a bit quickly, but that was my story for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you again to all of our panelists for presenting. I know we're a little bit behind schedule. We got a little bit of a late start, but now is the time.